What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Just wanted to let you know before you start that this is a compilation video of new stories to the channel. The video will have a black background just like the Sunday compilations, and also like those compilations, there will only be ads after the first 3 stories. Other than that, you're perfectly free to enjoy the video in the background however you'd like. Use it to sleep, use it as a podcast while you're drawing, or however you feel. Without further ado though guys, I will let you get right into these new stories, so thank you very much for watching, and I hope you guys really enjoy these. One night in July, a friend and I were road tripping home from a long vacation. We'd been on the road for hours on end, and were growing very tired. We kept on pushing though, consuming supplements such as coffee, and engaging in motivational conversation to pass the time. My friend's eyes were quickly sinking though. I saw signs in the distance for the next exit. We decided to veer off to an exit for Springfield, Ohio. Instantly, we began the search for a motel to rest at. Up ahead in the distance, we saw a sign for Night's Inn. If you've never been to a Night's Inn, it's a fairly cheap motel. Minimum breakfast, extremely shady rooms, and cheap prices for each night. But you really get what you pay for. My friend and I approached the front desk and requested a room. The owner seemed to hardly speak any English, but after dealing with a language barrier for about 10 minutes, everything seemed to be situated. We were set to stay in room 13. As we made our way to that room, we began to grow more and more tired. I slid the key into the door, and after a subtle click, the door unlocked. I pushed my way inside the room. As you might imagine, it was extremely underwhelming and had the faint smell of cigarettes and Cheetos. I kid you not. But hey, a room is a room, so after taking a shower, I climbed onto the twin-sized bed, and my friend did the same. Within 10 minutes or so, we'd both dozed off together. At 5 a.m. though, I was abruptly awoken by a heavy banging on the door. I glanced over to my friend, who shot up just as quickly as I did, trembling in fear. After about 3 minutes of being frozen there, I silently crawled over to my phone, avoiding the main window as to not be seen. I dialed 911 and explained the situation. They claimed they were sending an officer right away. The banging was still going on, so I screamed to the person outside, "What do you want?" Instantly, the banging stopped. I could hear muffled voices on the other side of the door. Then they began to fade away. At this point, it was around 5:30 a.m., still dark outside. I made my way over to the door and took a look out through the peephole. There was nothing there. As soon as I slipped back, though, a loud banging echoed throughout the room as someone began to pound on the window. A deep voice was heard laughing outside. It stopped soon after it began, and the cops never showed up. Right when daylight beamed through the window, we booked it over to the car and drove off. This, however, was not the most unsettling part. The next day, as soon as I got home, which was maybe another hour or so away, I began to watch the news. A 40-year-old man had been found at that Night's Inn. Room number 14, which was right next to the room we were staying in. He had many weapons with him and had kidnapped a 14-year-old girl who he claimed she was in love with him. To this day, I'm not sure exactly who was banging on my door that morning, but I have some suspicions, and I'm thankful I decided not to answer it. Now, I've been holding on to this story for 6 years or so, and I haven't really spoken about it to anyone. I went camping 6 years ago with an ex-boyfriend of mine. The campsite we'd picked was absolutely beautiful, and we were able to drive through some rough trails. The spot we picked was next to some hiking trails that weren't very far away from some natural hot springs and a huge waterfall. We were in the middle of nowhere though, so absolutely nobody else was around. We set up camp the next day and went hiking. We soaked up in the hot springs and came back down and had dinner together. So far, it was all going very well until the next day. I need to give you some context as to how we slept that night so you can fully understand my confusion. Before we went to sleep, I put our food cooler and the stereo we'd brought into the car and locked it up. I put the keys in the front pocket of my backpack and laid the backpack next to my sleeping bag on the right side of the tent. My boyfriend at the time slept nearest to the door of the tent with a gun next to him. We woke up the next morning and I felt pretty fine. I had slept pretty hard. From inside the tent, everything seemed perfectly normal. We got out to our campsite only to see it was in absolute chaos. The fire pit we'd made had been ruined. Our stuff had been thrown over and scattered everywhere. The stereo had even been smashed to pieces, laying next to a tree nearby. All of our car doors were open, including the trunk. We stood there for a minute in silence, just taking everything in. The woods felt off. It was quiet, and not like the peaceful place we'd seen yesterday. Everything felt wrong somehow. My ex accused me of not locking the door the night before, and that an animal had gotten into our things. I was absolutely sure I had done so, though. I went back into the tent to get the keys from my backpack and check, only to find they weren't there. I found them later, on the ground next to the car, which was a wake-up call for me. We stuffed everything into the trunk and left soon after. My boyfriend was quiet and wouldn't talk to me about what happened. He finally spoke up when we were almost home and told me that he'd had a dream that night. Somebody was leaning over him, holding a gun, just staring at him. When I tried to question him more, he said he didn't want to talk about it and I shouldn't speak about it ever again. I tried to forget about everything, but I just can't. Something wrong happened to us in those woods that night, and I can't really find a good explanation. My husband and I left Target late one night. Since it was winter time in Chicago, my husband was fine with me getting in the car to warm up while he loaded the back with our random assortment of Target goods. The parking lot was relatively empty, except for the car parked directly in front of us. I looked over at the car out of curiosity and noticed a man sitting in the driver's seat. Not wanting to stare too much, I looked away. I got a sudden feeling of chills all over though, and I snapped back to look at him again. My husband finally slid into the car, and I told him, "Hey, this guy in front of us, do you see this?" He looks and goes pale and says, "What the hell?" He was not looking at us. He was not looking at anything. His eyes were so sunken in, they almost looked like black voids in the sockets. His mouth was agape, like he was sleeping, but it was just a black hole too, no teeth or tongue. This might be due to obscured vision since it was nighttime, but we were also underneath a light, so the man was fairly illuminated, at least from above. The creepiest part though was his skin. Think the cockroach alien from Men in Black when he's in that guy's body. Some places of this guy's face were hanging off, and others were stretched super tight. It almost looked like a thing wearing a human face. The guy wasn't moving at all. "Let's get the hell out of here," said my husband. Obviously, we pulled out of there as quick as we could and triple-checked the locks on our doors that night. We still get creeped out just remembering it. My husband doesn't believe in the paranormal or anything outlandish, but even he knows there was something weird going on with that guy. He almost didn't even look human. I really think there was something wrong with him. There was a notorious murderer in my city. There was actually a security guard at the company where I worked before he was identified and caught. After he was apprehended, we discovered that he had kept the body of a small child in a cold water tank on the premises just a few yards away from where we all worked. Apparently, it had been there almost 2 years or so, but had never been found or even suspected until he gave the information to the police himself. The man is still in jail nearly 25 years later. It's even been proven with DNA that he was actually responsible for several murders in the area as well. He's serving compound life sentences. In actuality, the man was very friendly with me and my colleagues. As we came in and out of the building every day, he would smile and joke with us. In fact, the two of us even had an ongoing morning gag while he still worked there, well before his crimes were discovered. When my baby daughter was born, my wife and I brought her into the office to show her off. One day, I let this security guard, who was the father of an 8-year-old himself, hold my baby, as the body of a toddler he'd murdered was just a few feet away. There used to be an old abandoned school in a town by my house. It was heavily boarded up though and super hard to get into. A friend and I actually managed to get inside once by climbing up the side of the school via a pipe and a fire escape combo and slipping in through a window on the roof. We explored the basement, which was flooded and really creepy. Seeing stairs just disappear into water was such a strange sight. We had just left the gym area when we suddenly heard footsteps coming from the doors on the other side of the gym. It was especially scary, considering it sounded like it was coming from only a single person, not another group of intrepid explorers like us. Whoever it was blocking our path to the exit. There was no way back up to the roof with this guy there. The only way out otherwise was behind us through heavily boarded doors. Whoever it was sounded like they were pacing around and stopping periodically. There was no light coming from that direction. We couldn't fathom why someone would come into a creepy place like this all alone. We waited for the footsteps to stop, then snuck across the gym and peered down the hallways cautiously. We didn't see the person, so we continued toward the stairs which would lead us back to the roof. Around halfway down the hall, we heard someone sprinting towards us from behind. It was probably 50 meters away or so down a typical high school hallway. Now, it was mostly darkened here, but there was a small amount of light coming in through the cracks in the window boards. We couldn't make out anything behind us very well. We quickly ran up the stairs and didn't stop until we got back to the 4th floor. We listened for any additional noise, but nothing seemed to be happening. We hopped out the window and climbed back down the pipe. We got out of there in a real hurry. We never found out who that person was, and we have no idea why they could have been there either. In 2004, I moved out of my parents' house into a very small, one-bedroom apartment. It wasn't in the best neighborhood, but it was all I could afford at the time. A few months after I'd moved in, I woke up in the middle of the night to a voice on the other side of my bedroom door. Someone was there in the hallway, in the dark, only they were whispering my name over and over. The scariest part of this was that whoever was on the other side of that door stood in the dark hallway to my apartment and whispered my name for hours on end. My cell phone was on the kitchen counter charging, and I sat there for hours helpless and beyond scared. When the sun finally started to rise, I heard the person walk away, and I never encountered anything like that again. I met my friend Nick in middle school. At the time, we weren't really friends, but I did get to know him a little bit. Frankly, he scared me. When I first met him, he was one of those kids who wore all black and gave himself piercings. He would do it during class using safety pins. He was bipolar and had a slew of other issues as well, including being on drugs at the time. Fast forward a few years to high school, and I didn't really have any friends. I was kind of a loner. I have a fall birthday, so I was one of the first kids in my class to turn 16 and get my license and start driving myself to school. Nick had since grown out of the goth, druggy phase. He got on medication for his psychological problems and now seemed like a fairly normal guy. One day, he was talking to me and asked me if I could give him a ride home. I was all too happy to help, considering at the time I was pretty desperate for someone to hang out with. I ended up becoming very good friends with him and another guy he hung out with as well. The three of us pretty much spent all of high school as a tight-knit group. Looking back, I think they kind of took advantage of me, as my family had more money than either of theirs. I was happy to share though. I drove them to lunch and paid for it every time when they said they didn't have money. It would never be anything major, just a few bucks here and there. We did have some really good times too. They were pretty good guys for most of the time, but I do feel like that was at least part of the reason why they became my friends at all. Even if that was the case though, it was worth it for me because they were literally the only bright spot in my otherwise miserable high school experience. Nick could be an ass sometimes, especially if you spent more than a day or so with him at a time. I took a week-long beach trip with his family and ended up spending more time with his brother than him because he drove me absolutely insane. There was even a particular incident at a go-kart track where he was literally screaming at a 10-year-old kid and trying to pick a fight with the kid's father after the race. Why, you ask? All because he'd cut him off on the track. Then he got pissed at me for not backing him up when I was too busy trying to crawl into a corner and pretend like I didn't know him. It was all just so ridiculous. I was embarrassed. Actually, friend or not, I was hoping the guy would kick his ass because he deserved it. After high school, Nick stayed in our hometown and went to local community college. Me and the other guy went to State University, a few hours away. We actually were roommates. We would see Nick when we came home on the weekends. After that year, he joined us. Nick was really struggling though, and was in and out of school, never really trying that hard. At one point, his girlfriend from high school cheated on him, and he took it pretty hard. They started adjusting his medication. I don't think they ever got it quite right, because he was never the same again. During this time, I introduced him to my girlfriend's sister. We actually had gone to school with her, but never really knew her until I started dating her sister. Anyway, they started dating as well. At first, it was cool because we could go on double dates and stuff. I was a little worried though, because I knew how he could be sometimes. I was afraid of what might happen if their relationship ever went south. Her parents really hated him. I was always trying to defend him best I could, without making them hate me too. I'd since gotten engaged to my girlfriend, so I felt like I was always in the middle between my future in-laws and one of my best friends. Eventually, they got engaged too. Her parents really hated that they'd rushed into getting married. I think they'd been together less than a year at the time they moved in. Things quickly went south though. He started expecting her to support him. He quit going to school and said he was going to live on disability for the rest of his life because of all of his issues. They fought pretty much constantly, and they had only been married for about 4 to 5 months. Then he even started threatening to kill her. He even went as far as to detail the plans he had come up with to do it and get away with it. Needless to say, she left soon after, and they got divorced within less than a year. As you can imagine, this put me in quite the awkward spot of having to choose between my fiancée and her family, or one of my only friends. I tried to defend him as best I could. You know, he's not really like that usually. His medication is messed up. He doesn't really mean it. He won't really do that. I mean, how truly can you stick up for someone who's threatening to murder his wife, though? I did the best I could, but ultimately, if I wanted to keep my fiancé, I had to lose that friend. Our other friend was supposed to have been my best man, but he refused after what happened with Nick, so I ended up losing both my friends over the ordeal, pretty much exactly what I'd been afraid of. The next time I spoke to Nick, he came into the store I was working at with some people I had never seen before. I said hey and gave him a friendly wave, but he immediately flipped me off and walked out. That was confirmation our friendship was completely over. I'm not really sure how any of that was my fault, but I guess I was supposed to leave my 6-year relationship and break things off with my lover because this guy was a psychopath and threatened to kill her sister. I really wish that was the end of the story, but it continued on. Her sister found someone new, who was an amazing guy and one of my now closest friends. I have far more in common with him than any of my old friends. I graduated, got married, moved homes, and now started a family. My now wife's sister got remarried to the new guy, and they had a kid together who's now 3 years old. Everyone was happy, and we pretty much forgot about Nick. That was until the day he came back into town and started working at the local grocery store. My mother-in-law was the first to notice him and pretty much forbade her daughter from shopping there. She was terrified he would come after her or her kid if he saw them. They ended up moving away to the other side of town. I wasn't as threatened by him though, so I continued to shop there. I assumed since it had been 5 years, he must have moved on with his life. I would see him working at the register or whatever, but other than that, I really didn't go out of my way to avoid him. One day, I saw him looking at me though. I didn't speak to him because of the way our last interaction was gone. I was met with the coldest stare I'd ever seen. After that, anytime I was in the store, he would follow me around the entire time. When I left the store, he would head outside and pretend to bring carts in or something and watch me until I was in the car leaving. The last time I shopped there, I made the mistake of taking my newborn son with me. He started fussing, so of course I picked him up and tried to calm him down. At that point, Nick walked by and slammed into me, trying to make me drop my baby. Then he walked off like nothing had happened. I decided that day it would be best if I started shopping at Walmart instead. I realized that I'd forgotten to sit the trash out to be picked up. It was around 3 a.m. when I went back outside to move the cans to the curb. As I walked out of my garage, a large van with blacked out windows suddenly came down the street and stopped at the end of my driveway. I was nervous since it was 3 a.m. and it was clearly not my neighbor. I took my time fiddling with the cans beside the house, waiting to see what they were going to do. Eventually, they went down the street and stopped. I put the cans out as fast as I could and went back inside, making sure all the doors were locked. I went to sleep with my gun on the nightstand. Around this time, my grandmother's house was broken into too. Whoever did it knew where everything was in her house because they didn't rummage through anything. They just took all of her sentimental items, then went straight to the closet where my grandfather's guns were and took several of them as well. About a week later, they returned and cleaned out everything they hadn't taken the first time. We had no proof, so the cops wouldn't do anything, but I'm fairly certain it was Nick. He had been to her house before, and I had shown him the guns when we were friends. Since whoever it was broke in knowing exactly what they were looking for and exactly where to find it, that narrowed down the list of suspects. Since then, I've seen that van driving around in front of my house at all hours of the night. It's becoming less frequent since I started shopping elsewhere, and thankfully nothing more serious has happened. I have to keep a gun nearby at night now, and I'm still hoping this doesn't escalate again. About 4 years ago, I was a junior at a small college in LA County, bordering my town. There was a large cavernous region known as Turnbull Canyon. It's the kind of place that has a healthy amount of creepy folklore surrounding it, with an area emphatically known as Hell's Gates. Stories of cult activity, gang killings, abandoned mental institutions, and the like. The kind of shit you'd hear about any place old enough to have a reputation. In reality, most of these stories were spurned from a tragedy that occurred years prior. A woman's body had been found at the base of the canyon. From then on, the rest is history. Nevertheless, when a photographer friend asked me and another buddy to go out to the canyon in order to help him take some photos of the LA skyline, I had to oblige. The canyon is about a 30-minute drive from our campus. Now, we had been listening to the King of Limbs the entire drive, which proved to be the perfect ambience to get me feeling pretty anxious about our excursion. I should also note I'm a pretty anxious guy in general, so traveling out to a remote area preceded by its reputation for frightening occurrences admittedly had me thinking twice about the decision. At the top of the canyon, there's a small residential area with a few ritzy houses surrounded by trees and woods. In order to venture into the canyon itself, though, you have to follow a main trail with several smaller arteries that split off in random directions. Ultimately, they all culminate at the base of a steep hill, adorned with an old water tower overlooking the city. Anyhow, we parked our car at the top of the canyon road, got out the camera gear, and made our way out to the trailhead. It was around 1 a.m. at this point. After watching the trail for about 5 minutes, Dave the photographer decided it was time to set up his first shot, while Jeff, our other friend, and I kept watching. Eventually, he got the shot he needed, and we continued walking for another 5 minutes or so. Dave set up his next shot, and so on and so on. At this point, the trailhead had disappeared behind us completely. We were a little less than a quarter mile away from the water tower. While setting up the tripod again, we noticed the faint glow of headlights off in the distance. That was pretty strange. This trail was not meant for cars, nor was it big enough for them to pass through. If I recall correctly, it was only 5 feet wide, with shrubbery on both sides. This was clearly a red flag for us, as we were the only people out there. Immediately, we packed up our things and ducked off into the brush, waiting for the car to pass on. Eventually, an old pickup truck idled to a stop about 50 yards from where we were hiding. The truck itself was very old and rickety, sitting on a lifted chassis, the bed of which was missing entirely. Growing up in the country, I knew this was the type of truck typically owned by backwoods folk who lived out in the boonies and preferred to be left to their own devices. We watched in agonizing anticipation as the truck idled in place for several minutes before flooring it down one of the other trails. The roar of the engine echoed throughout the canyon. Clearly, we were spooked at this point. The three of us speculated as to our next step. Jeff and I were reluctant to continue, while Dave assured us it was probably nothing, just a guy off-roading in his spare time, as he put it. With great reluctance, Jeff and I trudged on behind Dave toward the water tower to get his final shots. Nevertheless, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about that truck. I mean, I knew plenty of people in high school who would go off-roading for fun in the woods, but never on finicky canyon trails barely wide enough to hike on. It just didn't sit right with me. After walking without interference for an hour, we finally made it to the water tower and climbed up to the top and took in the view of the city. Once again, Dave started setting up his equipment, while Jeff and I stood on both sides of the water tower keeping watch, just in case the truck came back. At this point, though, there was nothing. It was around 3 a.m. when Dave decided he'd finally got all the shots he needed. We packed up the equipment and committed to heading out before it got too late. Just as we were preparing to descend the hill, the truck comes roaring out of the canyon below us, back onto the trail. At that point, the driver attempted to climb the hill, revving his engine quite loudly. Scared, the three of us slid off the side of the hill into the brush once more, clinging on to plants and rocks as the truck shot to the top of the hill, slowly driving in circles around the tower. We could see the glow of headlights each time it circled above us. After waiting for nearly 10 minutes, while also trying not to make any noise, the truck eventually descended back down the hill, stopping in the middle of the trail, no more than 100 yards away. We watched a scruffy man in his mid-50s step out of the truck and into the glow of its headlights, moseying around, looking at the ground. Then he wrote something down on the dirt, surveying the area intently. It became increasingly apparent to us that he was tracking something, our footprints. This next part still chills me to the bone, as my friends and I huddled together, watching in complete terror. Another man wearing a long dark parka emerged from the bush where we'd been hiking just a bit before. joining the other man at his side. Apparently, he'd been out there the entire time while we were walking the trail, just following behind at a safe distance. The two of them talked for a while. We couldn't hear a word as they continued scanning the area, searching for our footprints. Eventually, they got back in the truck and drove down one of the forks in the trail. We sat there in silence for a long time, waiting nearly 2 hours to ensure the coast was clear. At that point, we made it like hell back to the car, down the canyon, and back to our campus, just in time for class in the morning. About 2 years ago, me and a buddy decided to go on a drive. It was a hot summer's night, and we were bored out of our minds. He picked us up some cigarettes, and we went out on a late-night ride. We decided to drive to the top of the mountain. The base of this mountain was about an hour's drive from where I lived, and it took another hour to drive all the way to the top where they had a restaurant and bar. It was pretty late, around 3 in the morning or so we knew the bar would already be closed. Still though, we thought we could just chill on the benches and have a relaxing smoke, take in the view at first light. We get to the base of the mountain and start driving up and around the road. This road twists all around the mountain until you get to the very top, so when you reach a turn, you can barely see around the corner, especially in this pitch-black darkness. Only the road was visible, due to the streetlights being far and few apart from the road. The edges of the mountainside were barely visible. We had been driving for about half an hour. Everything was pretty enjoyable. Absolutely empty roads and complete silence. It was very relaxing. All of a sudden though, as we turned around one of the bends, I got this very uneasy feeling. I saw something that was definitely out of place here. There appeared to be a person sitting on a boulder at the very edge of the road. My friend saw this as well and kept on driving. I guess he wanted to see what was going on though, because he turned the car around and started going back toward the person. It's pretty treacherous to reverse on that sort of road, so he turned completely around and headed back slowly. My friend didn't seem to be getting the same bad feelings as I was. He was in a completely normal mood, so I convinced myself I was simply acting weird. We parked the car opposite of this figure, engine still running. He rolled down the window and called out to them. Hi there, are you okay?" I have to admit, I was still pretty scared. I didn't say anything. There was no response from the figure. They simply looked up in our direction. We could see it was a woman wearing some sort of dress. Her eyes were completely blank, and she had this strange smile on her face. I swear, we both felt so fearful in that moment we were completely paralyzed. We couldn't even yell or communicate, not a single word. It almost felt like we couldn't move. I don't know how my friend found the courage to press the gas and get the hell out of there. I do remember that when we got home though, we both had a very high fever, and we were both like that for a couple more days afterward. I remember one night I was in bed getting ready to go to sleep. I was around 17 years old or so, living in my parents' basement. I heard someone open the basement door and start walking down the steps. It sounded like they were wearing flip-flops, which was odd because it was very cold outside at the time. The steps continued downward. They stopped at a point where I couldn't see who it was. I thought it might be my brother, but he was out with his friends, and he never wore flip-flops either. I called out anyway. "Jake, is that you?" No answer. The walking continued toward my door. "Dad? Mom?" Still no answer. The knob on my door started to turn, but no dice for whoever was outside. It was already locked. I heard an audible, disappointed sigh. Then whoever it was walking away from my door and back up the steps. I was straight up scared as hell. I grabbed a baseball bat and slowly ventured out into the living room. I began to check the house. There was no one in the bathroom, no one in my brother's room, no one on the steps either. We had 2 phone lines at that house, so I called my parents' line. "Hey, Dad, did you see any headlights come up the driveway or hear anyone come into the house?" He hadn't. Were you and Mom just home? Did you come downstairs wearing flip-flops or something?" "What? No, go back to bed, son." I did eventually. I thought someone must have snuck into our house. It was the most genuinely terrified I had ever been, but I never really found out who it was in the end. I like primitive camping. Me and my wife go out sometimes by ourselves. We usually bring the dog along with us and spend a couple of nights out there. This time, we invited some friends along for the drinking shenanigans. On the first day, we heard a vehicle coming down the road. It wasn't too odd, but there were about 10 more sites on this several miles of road. It was a dirt road with nothing there but these primitive camping sites. One way in, one way out. What is odd, though, was that this vehicle appeared to be some sort of meat-packing truck. It was really old, and all the lettering on the side of the truck was faded or gone already. It was fading beige and completely decrepit looking. None of us could actually see the person driving it, but there were no tags or plates on the back at all. We all began to get pretty creeped out because of this, but collectively kind of decided it wasn't as weird as we thought. We just went back to enjoying our night out. Flash forward to the next morning. My mom called me, and she was panicking, freaking out. Apparently, some hikers had just been abducted right near where we were. There are several girls at our site, including my wife. She was convinced it was that car. I wanted to know how nearby this had happened, so I pulled up my GPS and an article I found out about it, with their last known locations. I found out they had been kidnapped less than a half a mile away from where we were. I legitimately don't remember what happened after that, but I was scouring away on the news for years. It's hard to find an article these days. I want to say they found one of the girls tied to a tree. Apparently, there are quite a lot of people that get abducted and murdered on or near that parkway. I'm pretty sure that whoever was driving that meat truck was never found, and I'm also pretty sure they're the one that did that night. I was a bouncer at a bar years ago. It was a normal Friday night, completely packed with the usual customers. They knew not to get too crazy though. At around 11 o'clock, people usually started to get a bit out of hand, and sometimes I would have to break up a fight or two. Tonight was no different. Around midnight, this guy was getting a bit too touchy-feely with a girl in the crowd, and she really didn't like that. I had to escort the man out. Really, I kicked him out. You know, surprisingly, these guys I kicked out were always good guys who had just a bit too much to drink. Usually, I'd see them again and they would apologize profusely for their behavior. This Friday night, shortly before closing time, a man threw his drink at the bartender and cut his head open as well. I grabbed the guy and threw him outside. They would normally struggle for a second or two, then realize they had no chance of overpowering me. This guy was quite different though. He struggled the whole time, and he was almost able to stack up to me. I could tell he had a violent temperament and was very used to fighting. After his ass hit the sidewalk out front, he sat up and said something like he'd be back or whatever, and I would see him later. I can't remember the exact wording. Thankfully, the bartender was alright, but he needed to go get a fair few stitches. It was closing time anyway, so we just told everyone that we were now wrapping up. We would appreciate all of them making their way out. I helped to clean up, as I always did, and when I was finished up, my buddy who worked at the kitchen always left with me, out the back door. We were walking down the alleyway behind the place when the two of us noticed there was somebody behind us. We kept on walking. I turned left onto the street where my car was parked. My buddy crossed the street, and continued down the alley. I turned around to see if this guy would try to follow me or my friend, but I didn't see them cross the street or turn the corner. I got into my car and drove the miles away to my house. I had the following day off, but the day after that I was scheduled to work again. Before I left for work that night, my good friend and the owner of the bar called me and gave me some terrible news. My buddy, who was walking with me the other night, had been attacked and stabbed to death further down the alley. I couldn't believe it. I told the cops about that jerk in the bar that night, but they never found out who really killed them. I don't work in that bar anymore, but I did for another 2 years after the incident. That guy from that night never showed up there again. I very strongly feel that it was him who attacked and killed my buddy. The night that this happened to me was many years ago. Probably about 20 years ago now, actually. My single father moved myself and my 2 little sisters to a not terrible but also not great suburb of Denver, Colorado. The divorce had really shattered him and our home. My mother left him for another man, and the burden of raising 3 girls befell on him. Skip forward a couple of months. My sisters were 8 and 6 now. We had grown fairly accustomed to the neighborhood by then, and the surrounding areas as well. My dad had a schedule of working 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. out in Denver, where all the best pay was. Because of this, the responsibility for my 2 little sisters became mine. I was the eldest, after all. We hadn't quite melded with the other kids in the area yet, but being the 3 of us, we didn't really mind. We were capable of entertaining ourselves. We used to ride our bicycles everywhere, to all the surrounding neighborhoods, the hiking trails along the river, and pretty much everywhere else, even along the train tracks. We could find various amounts of them throughout town. One set of train tracks in particular, in fact the closest to our home, had a long ditch almost like a valley along both sides of it. I think in retrospect it must have been some sort of barrier to prevent the river from flooding out the neighborhood across the street. Anyway, on one side of the tracks, it was a sheer drop-off with heavy bushes and undergrowth preventing the ground from being easily accessible. On the other side, there had been a path carved out. It appeared to be carved out by vehicles, maybe servicing the train tracks perhaps in prior years. It was extremely deep though, and they called it Dead Man's Ditch. As I said, we used to ride our bikes around town a lot, especially in the summertime during the day, while our dad was at work. We would sometimes travel further away than he really allowed us to. We also had a game we played similar to Punch Buggy, combined with a license plate game. If any of us saw a license plate with double or triple characters consecutively, for example double B's or triple zeros, we would announce it and then attempt to hit one another. It was a barbaric game, but we were siblings having fun, so it wasn't too outlandish. I'm not going to share mine nor my sister's names here, but on this particular day we had been riding around for hours already, and were well past the hottest part of the day. It was cooling down and gearing up for sunset. We had made our way back toward home, and were less than a 2-minute bike ride from our house. I had been hanging a ways back, so both of my little sisters were in front of me. The youngest was out front, the middle coming up on her left, and myself 6 feet behind both of them. Just a few minutes prior to this, a silver sedan had driven past us going the opposite way. The car's plate number had double 6s on it, which I had called first as we were heading up the street. I heard a vehicle accelerating patiently behind me. This set off red flags, because where we were riding, we actually affected the oncoming lane. This vehicle was heading the same way we were. I turned to look and see, and automatically glanced first at the license plate. A silver sedan, Mr. 66. It seemed he was back now. I could see the driver, and he appeared to be a Hispanic man in his mid-40s, wearing a blue and red flannel shirt. He didn't say a single word though. He just looked at me for a second, then sped up, veering around us. I watched in horror as his open driver's side window lined up with my baby sister. He reached out and grabbed her hand and a handle for her bicycle. He slowed down a bit, trying to pull my sister off her bike and into his open window. Something must have happened to his car though, because as sudden as he had grabbed her, he released her again and slammed both hands back on the steering wheel. She took the chance and pushed like hell on her bike, racing towards Dead Man's Ditch. My other sister and I followed suit. After a moment of what I now recognize as tunnel vision, I heard the acceleration of the sedan behind me. By this time, we were all hysterical. I was trying to desperately see through my tears. This guy was clearly not going to give up. Whatever his deal was, he didn't want to let go of my sisters. Dead Man's Ditch was approaching quickly. Thinking on my feet, I directed both sisters down into the ditch, assuming 6 wouldn't destroy his own vehicle, attempting to follow us. My youngest sister cowered in fear at the top of the ditch, being afraid of falling down so far. My middle sister didn't need to be told twice though. She slid down the hill like it was nothing. As I caught up to them, the car was right against my back tire. I told them to just go. I was pretty sure this guy was going to kill us. I remember my other sister taking a huge breath and finally going down the hill. I held my breath until I was right behind her. All 3 of us made it down to the bottom. The man pulled his car right up to the opening of the path. He got out. I could see he was naked, wearing only the aforementioned flannel shirt, and boasting a giant hard-on, which he proceeded to tug and wave in our general direction. I stood between my sisters and this creep. After a few minutes of exposure, I guess he decided we weren't worth the destruction of his car. He jumped back in the driver's seat and drove away. My sisters and I were hysterical, although my 10-year-old mind had switched to business mode. My tears ceased, only followed by my concern. I now somehow needed to get my sisters home safely. We waited for about a half an hour, but the car never came back around. We braved emerging from the trail and hightailed it home. When we got home, we told Dad everything, and he was understandably outraged. He actually took us around in his car to drive around the neighborhood and try to find the man's car. We couldn't find it. My dad called the police once we got back home, and we filed a report. Unfortunately, with only a description of a silver 4-door car with a license plate beginning with 66 and a Hispanic older man, that wasn't enough to track him down. They filled in Dead Man's Ditch a couple of months later, but not before it had managed to save our lives. I'm telling this story on behalf of my best friend Tom, who I've known ever since childhood. He served with the Army for several years as an infantry with the 1st Battalion 75th Ranger Regiment. After he returned home from his combat tour in Afghanistan, he had more than a few stories to tell. I'm immensely sad to say that we lost Tom in a car accident recently. However, this one story from his time in Afghanistan, I've always felt was a good one to share. Tom also agreed. He visited horror communities occasionally, but had never found the time to sit down and share his experiences. Because of that, there are many stories that will forever remain just between me and him. But I know this one is one he always really wanted to share, so I'm gonna do my best to pass it along. I want to note that the details are somewhat hazy, as it's been a long time since I last heard him tell it. In 2013, Tom's unit was deployed to Afghanistan, specifically the Kandahar province. He had gone through immensely difficult training, up to and including jumping out of several airplanes to get to where he was now. As such, he was eager to finally do his job. He ultimately participated in 19 combat missions during his 4 months in country. Almost all of them night raids aimed at high-value targets, local Taliban cell commanders, and other persons of interest. You see, the Rangers and other special operation forces like that specialize in nighttime operations. They train at night and operate frequently under the cover of darkness. The Taliban lacked widespread night vision optics, whereas each individual ranger was equipped with some of the finest. The accessories to complement them with that advantage too, on top of their large numbers and superior training. It was hard for them to not feel like they owned the night whenever they went out. This wasn't always the case though. One night, Tom's platoon was tapped for yet another high-value target raid. After the briefing and preparation process, the 30 or so guys boarded the Canucks and proceeded to the targeted location. Disembarking under the cover of darkness, they went to secure the area. Tom was a member of a two-man machine gun team. His team leader, Corporal Kyle, manned the M24 machine gun. As his assistant gunner, it was Tom's responsibility to carry spare linked ammunition belts, call out fire adjustments, and act as a bodyguard. After leaving the chopper, Tom and Kyle moved forward to their designated blocking position, a vantage point in which a fire team can set up and intercept enemy forces. The target in this case was a small village, seemingly abandoned and heavily deteriorated, with crumbling masonry and multiple bombed-out huts. The entire place was incredibly unsettling, showing no signs of life other than a single black cat. The moon was high in the sky, bathing the ramshackle collection of seemingly ancient structures in an eerie light. After ensuring everything was set up, Tom surveyed the village, focusing on a damaged stone wall less than 50 meters away. There was a hole punched out in the center of it, just large enough for a man to stick his head and shoulders through. He watched the hole intently for almost the entirety of the time. He had his gun lined up at the ready, expecting the barrel of a gun to appear at any moment, but it never did. The rifle teams proceeded into the village and searched it from top to bottom, finding no trace of the high-value target they were after, nor any signs of life at all. Kyle and Tom relocated to link up with several members in a large ditch over 100 meters away from the target site. They continued to watch the perimeter as discussions were being held on how to proceed. That's when all hell broke loose. One of the platoon's senior sergeants came running over, yelling at Tom and the other rangers to get the fuck out of the ditch. The comms net exploded with orders to fall back to the LZ for immediate extraction. Tom and Kyle were beyond confused. The Canucks double-timed it back to the location and landed, allowing everyone to board. After a final head count to ensure no one had been left behind, the helicopters lifted off and returned to the airfield. The mission had lasted less than an hour, seemingly ending as soon as it all began, without a single shot being fired. No contact with anyone either. After returning to the base, they were debriefed, and the reason for such a sudden scrub of the mission became very clear. Shortly after Tom and Kyle had posted up in the ditch, signal collection specialists attached to the Rangers had picked up on enemy radio chatter. They were in the vicinity of the assault force. They had heard the Taliban say that there were 6 men in the ditch, 2 of them manning the machine gun. They told them to flank the men, then proceeded to list a multitude of details about the assault force and their positions. They were stalking the Rangers in the night. Based on the chatter, it was clear an unknown number of insurgents were setting up a deadly ambush. Other than the intercepted broadcast, these Rangers had been completely unaware of their presence. None of the men on the ground had seen any indication of enemy activity. The trained canines hadn't picked up on any scent. The drones and Overwatch aircraft circling the area didn't see a damn thing, even with thermal vision. Yet the Taliban were listing numerous meticulous details about the task force, as if they were standing right next to them. It was a humbling experience for the entire platoon. For Tom, that mission always sent a shiver up his spine looking back on it, even though later ops during the same campaign involved full-scale firefights and even other ambushes as well. I was hiking through a set of old train tunnels in Colorado with another female friend of mine. When we got to the last and longest train tunnel, we both got this horrible feeling that we were being watched. We entered the tunnel and began walking toward the other side. We kept hearing these strange echoes and noises, but we both just nervously laughed it off. We had one flashlight to share between us, and it was pointed at the middle of the tunnel. It started to die right as we passed the halfway point. Before it went out, though, we saw this really creepy, white, faceless, man-sized doll. It looked like it had been stabbed repeatedly in the face. White stuffing was leaking out of all the holes. We began to hear a loud shuffling behind us. The light went out soon after, and we hauled ass and ran to the end of the tunnel. On the way back, we took an alternate route, and neither of us ever went back to that trail again. When I was a kid in the mid-90s, my friends and I were hiking around the woods behind our house on some timber property. It was at that point we found an abandoned farmhouse. The weird thing was, though, that the house looked like it had been left very suddenly. There was still unopened mail and magazines sitting on the coffee table, all dated back to the 1950s. The sheets and blankets were still on the beds, and the clothes were still in the drawers even. There was a pantry full of canned and jarred food, half of it either exploded or leaking after so many years. There were even dishes in the sink, dishes on the table, unburned candles still waiting to be used. As we checked the refrigerator outside, we found it full of what used to be food that had long since been turned to muck and dust. After exploring the house for a while, we checked out the farm portion as well. The chicken coop had dozens of chicken skeletons. There were 2 pig skeletons in a pen, and the remains of a horse and several cows in the surrounding pasture. It never occurred to me as a kid at the time of discovery, but aside from the house having been left so suddenly, it was really remarkable that this entire scene had remained undisturbed for all this time. There was no signs of vandalism, no signs of entry at all. As far as I could tell, we were the first people to set foot upon this unsettling discovery in nearly 40 years. I always wonder what the backstory behind that place was. I watched security cameras for a transport company in Detroit. It was roughly 2 a.m., and I was there watching the cameras as usual. That was when I noticed a woman in a nightgown standing at the end of the driveway of the facility. The facility is fenced and gated, so I kept an eye on this suspicious figure. She just kinda stood there for 5 minutes though, not really moving at all, just kind of swaying back and forth. There weren't too many people working that late, but just to be safe, I let everyone at the facility know there was a woman standing outside the gate. One driver decided he needed to hit the road. When he exited the gate though, the woman walked right in front of his truck, blocking him in. I immediately phoned the police. He blared his horn, and then the woman rushed to the side of his truck and attempted to force open his door. He sped away, leaving the woman standing there. She continued to stand there in one place, not moving for about 10 minutes. Eventually, she just kinda walked away into the darkness, never to be seen by us again. The police never showed up either. My work has me walking and running around the whole plant all shift. We usually cover around 12 to 16 kilometers on a good day. Combine this with Ontario's negative 30 degrees Celsius winters and a deadly crosswind caused by open shipping doors, making for a pretty damn rough shift. I was close to death 4 hours in, so my coworker told me she'd cover for me while I went and took a quick nap in my car. I parked in the assembly plant's parking lot across the street from ours, so the supervisor couldn't see me. No more than 15 minutes into my 3 a.m. nap, though, I was startled awake by someone tapping on my window. Looking around, I could see the parking lot was basically deserted. Whoever woke me up just then must have either ran away in the split second it took me to open my eyes, or evaporated into thin air or something. I decided to head back into work and told my coworker about what happened. Her response confused me. "Oh, yeah, that happens all the time. With everyone working the night shift, we don't know who's doing it. Apparently, they only do that whenever they see someone sleeping. I haven't taken a nap in the parking lot since. It's pretty freaky." This story takes place 2 years ago while I was still in primary school. I was 12 at the time. There was this organization for young girls who needed help building their self-confidence. Basically, they'd have fun while they still could, because once we get to high school, the activities wouldn't be arranged anymore. One day, there weren't too many girls there, so the leaders, we'll call them Lisa and Beth, decided to just bring the class to the playground next to the school, where we went twice a week. It was around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. At the opposite end of the playground was a row of houses. There was a woman in maybe her late 30s and a boy about 7 years old in the corner. They both had dark hair and looked to be of Asian descent. I don't remember what they were doing exactly, but I remember getting a very uneasy feeling about this couple of people. I didn't really like the woman especially, and didn't want to get very close to her. There was something wrong with her mannerisms. It gave me the real creeps. Luckily though, they stayed in the corner, and I stayed close to Lisa and Beth. I figured it would all be okay. We played for about 15 minutes before we took a short break. I just happened to be randomly looking in the direction of the fence when I noticed a boy at the end of the playground behind the fence. He was about 25 feet from the mother and the other boy. He looked about the same age and had blonde hair. I thought this was odd, as this young child was there all alone. I suddenly noticed the mother walking toward one of the houses on the opposite side of the playground. I spotted the two boys approaching each other. I turned around to Lisa, when suddenly my friend Jody ran past me crying hysterically. Lisa began to panic at Jody's behavior and asked what was wrong. Before they could get a straight answer out of her though, I heard the sounds of a scuffle. I looked back and noticed the two boys were now locked in a physical altercation. Then I noticed the woman returning from the house she'd went to. My blood went ice cold when I noticed she was holding a large knife in her hand, heading directly toward the two boys. All the girls in my group ran out of the playground with two of them crying. I stood paralyzed and shaking, convinced I was going to witness a woman stabbing a 7-year-old boy to death. Beth began moving quickly toward the woman to intercept her, and Lisa went to break up the fighting boys. When Beth asked the woman why she had a knife, she just laughed sarcastically and said something about clearing some branches to make a tree house. Obviously, that made no sense at all, especially because it was the middle of autumn, so there were branches all over the ground anyway. Lisa called the police, and we were all told to move further away for safety. 10 minutes later, we noticed red and blue lights coming from the distance. I tried comforting Jody, who was still crying, but I was having trouble keeping a brave face myself. After being confronted by Beth, the strange woman ran back to her house and put the knife away. I guess she got the sense the police were on their way. After the police arrived, she was interviewed, but wasn't taken into custody, probably because there wasn't any evidence to arrest her. The mother of the second boy eventually arrived and held him close. I don't know why she'd left him there all alone. I assume he must have walked away from her and she lost him or something. Anyway, that's my story. I don't know what she was planning on doing with that boy who was fighting with her son, but with such a large knife, her intentions could not have been good. When me and my best friend were younger, we would ask our babysitter to take us to the school playground at night so we could play hide and seek together. We lived in a small town where everyone knew everyone else. We were all friendly with one another, so this wasn't abnormal or dangerous in the least, at least not at the time. We never went past our bedtime usually, but sometimes our parents were cool and let us stay up late to play hide and seek. At one point, I was trying to find my friend and the babysitter. As I looked for them, a car slowly drove by the playground. The car's lights were off, and the windows were tinted as well. I watched as this car drove by, and got the distinct feeling that whoever was inside was watching me. As they left out of sight though, I almost instantly forgot about it, and went back to seeking. It came to be somewhere around midnight, and our babysitter thought it was about time to go home. Of course, we cried and begged for us to stay a little longer, but he said it was too late now. We started to walk up the hill that was behind the school when we all heard a car behind us. We looked over to see the same car driving through the grass towards us. My babysitter instantly grabbed both of us and threw us over his shoulders. He started running toward the bushes that cut us off from the other street. The car sped up, and so did my babysitter. As we arrived at the bushes, my babysitter forced us up and through a metal fence. I ended up getting cuts everywhere, but worst of all, I cut my leg on the fence and it was bleeding quite badly. I could hear the driver of the car calling out to us, asking in a kind voice, "Where are you?" Then in a serious and scary voice, "I know you're in there. I'm gonna find you." We ended up running to a house that had the lights on, and our babysitter banged on the door, begging them to let us inside. He screamed out that he had kids with him, and one of them was bleeding badly. A woman who we knew as Emily opened the door and pretty much dragged us inside. She shut the door behind her. Later that night, the police were called, and I was sent to the hospital to get stitches and a shot for the rusty metal I had cut my leg on. The story doesn't end there though. Later that week, my dad was watching the news as usual when a story came up. It showed the playground we were at a couple of nights ago and showed two medics rolling out a body covered in a white sheet. Apparently, the girl had been dead and had been there for a couple of days. The killer was never found, so he could still be out there. Sometimes I wonder if the man from that night in the car was the very same man that perpetrated that crime. If he had caught us, would we have been in the same situation that girl ended up in? Maybe she would be alive, watching the news to see our bodies being rolled into an ambulance instead. It makes me feel guilty, but I will never and have never stepped another foot in that playground ever since this happened. When this happened, I was about 12 or 13. I was staying the night at my friend Rose's house, and her mom left us to care for her little sister while she went out for a few hours. Being the good babysitters that we were, we decided to head over to a local park that had a playground just to hang out for a while and let her little sister play around. We had been there for about 30 minutes and were just hanging out pushing her little sis on the swings when two guys showed up out of nowhere. They sat down at a picnic table close to the playground. The first guy looked to be in his teens, probably around 5'10", short dark brown hair, brown eyes, and a medium build. The other guy though had to have been in his early 30s. He was very large, about 6'1" and 250 pounds. He had this giant beard and shoulder-length curly hair with green eyes. We noticed them when they sat down, but didn't really give them a second thought. Apart from their age and unusual physical appearance for this area, there was really nothing that stood out about them. That was until the older guy, whose name was apparently Chris, decided to start up a conversation with us. At first, he asked us our names, and they gave us theirs as well. Then they asked what we were up to today, still being fairly polite. As a kid, I was raised to be very respectful of my elders, so I answered him, but kept my answer short. I continued to play with Rose and her sister, and he kept asking us questions. Where were we headed later? Did we want to hang out with him and his nephew instead, who was the younger guy apparently, a guy whose name I can't remember. All of this while getting closer and closer to us. We told them we were going home after Rose's sister was done playing, and that we weren't allowed to go anywhere else. He then offered some beer that he had with him and asked me if I smoked. I'd never drunk any alcohol up to that point, and I wasn't about to start that night. I declined his offer. He then started talking about how pretty I was and asked if I had a boyfriend. Without skipping a beat, he told me he'd recently gotten out of jail and was looking for a young girlfriend. I told him I didn't have one, but that I wasn't interested in having one like him either. During this whole interaction, he would occasionally address his attention to his nephew. From the interactions they were having, I quickly caught on they were in some sort of gang. That's when I started to get a bit nervous. Even I knew you didn't mess with the people in the local gangs. I knew we had to be careful about what we said next. He was quiet after that, and I figured they were going to move on and bug someone else. I was wrong though. He asked me if I wanted to hang out with them again, instead telling us how much fun we would have and how they could buy us whatever we wanted. I told him again we couldn't do so, and we had to watch Rose's little sister. He went quiet again. I know we should have just picked up and left right then, but I had just started getting into my rebellious stage and thought we could handle these guys no problem. Surely they weren't really a threat. We weren't ready to go back to Rose's house just yet. He sat at another picnic table, thinking that if we ignored them they would get the hint and go away. Of course not though. Not 1 minute later, Chris and his nephew came and sat down right next to us. His nephew stayed at one end of our table. Chris came and sat right next to me. He started talking to me again about how pretty I was and how he could be my boyfriend. We should go hang out at his place or whatever. I wanted to go at this point. His nephew actually started looking kind of nervous. He started chatting with Rosa. I could tell though he realized just how young we really were and that his uncle was really about to cross the line. He told his uncle he thought they should go do something else because Rosa and I weren't allowed to do the stuff they wanted. Chris wasn't having any of that though. I don't remember what he said next. He was sitting next to me. The next thing I know though, he put his arms around my shoulders and pulled me into his side. I was completely caught off guard and didn't even know how to react. I'd never had an older guy that close to me, let alone touching me like that. I know I should have at least pushed him away or done something, but I froze. He kept saying again and again how he would be my boyfriend and take care of me from then on, asking me to go somewhere with him. I started slowly trying to get out from under his arm without trying to make a big deal out of it. At this moment, I was getting really scared. He was getting pushy, and I didn't want to piss him off, as it was just us in the park. I couldn't see or hear anyone else around. He then pulled me closer to him, and this time he kissed me. It wasn't just a quick little peck on the cheek either. It was a forceful, lingering kiss that completely threw me off. My mind started racing. I couldn't believe what just happened. Even Rose was sitting there with a complete look of shock on her face. I decided I'd had enough of this, and we had to get out of there. I pulled away one last time. It was now very obvious what he had on his mind. I told him it was getting late and we had to get home, as her mom was expecting us soon. He didn't seem very happy hearing that. I told him maybe after we could come back and hang out with him a bit more. It was obvious he didn't want to let me go, but we promised we would come back after. Finally, I guess he either believed me or decided to just let me go. I grabbed Rose's little sister to carry her home. I had turned around and was getting ready to tell Rosa we had to leave. Suddenly, he seemed to have changed his mind. He rushed over to me and grabbed me from behind. He pulled me into him kind of like a bear hug, with his whole body pressed up against mine. A flood of emotions ran through me at that moment. Fear, confusion, and still a bit of denial he would really do something to hurt me. I knew that was wrong either way. I needed to get the hell away from this guy. I was kind of in a state of shock, but I knew I had to keep my wits about me. I decided to play along and try to work out a way for him to let us leave without making him mad or think I was lying to him. I told him that if we weren't back on time, Rose's mom would come out looking for us personally. I promised him we would just drop her sister off and come back right away. He let me go, but he didn't seem convinced. I told him as convincingly as I could that we had to take the little sister home and told him to just wait there for us. He seemed to have bought it. We quickly started walking back to Rose's house while he and his nephew sat at the table. As I glanced back, I saw his nephew trying to get him to leave again. I thought, great, they're leaving now. There's no way they're going to see where we're going or follow us. Wrong. Just as I thought they were going to leave in the opposite direction, the guy decided to follow us. We had a bit of a head start, but he was a really big guy and was gaining on us quickly. We hurried as fast as we could. We didn't want him to see where she lived. Once we got to her street, we took off running. We finally got back to Rose's apartment and thought we were in the clear. I could hear Chris calling out my name outside, but I couldn't see him. We got inside as quickly and quietly as we could. Once inside, we went over to the window. I could still hear him calling out my name and getting really close as well. We decided to stay quiet and carefully watch from the window to see if they had seen where we'd gone. Luckily, they walked right past our apartment. We both breathed a huge sigh of relief, then started freaking out. Neither of us had ever experienced anything like that before. We were just glad it was over now. We were in the clear. Shortly after that, Rose's mom got home. Neither of us had any intentions of telling her what had happened that night, as Rose's mom was not exactly the nicest. We were sure we would get into a lot of trouble, even though we didn't really do anything wrong. We went back upstairs and were just chatting with Rose's mom and her younger brother. Then we heard a knock at the door. My heart stopped, as I swore I could hear Chris's voice on the other side. We went back into the kitchen as Rose's mom went to answer the door. It was Chris and his nephew again. Somehow they must have seen us. They asked Rose's mom if we were there, but luckily we had been smart enough to give them fake names. And even then, Rose's mom was clearly having none of this. She told them to get the hell out of here and slammed the door in their face. Of course, she knew something was up and asked us if we knew them. We weren't about to admit that we did, though. We just told her we had no idea what was going on or who they were. I don't think she really bought it, but she left it at that. She told us not to answer the door. Later that evening, her mom had to go out again, so it was just Rose and I in the apartment now. We were hanging out in the living room, talking about how crazy what happened earlier turned out to be. Then we heard two voices that sounded very familiar, just outside the window. I was terrified to even move. Then came a knock at the door. There was no way we were going to answer it now. We kept as quiet as possible and prayed they would just go away. They called out our names and tried knocking again. One of them even tried turning the doorknob. Thankfully, Rose's mom had locked it on her way out. They tried knocking one more time. The last thing we heard was their footsteps walking away from the door. We never saw either of them again, and we didn't go back to that park again for quite some time. It was a surreal experience. However, I will never forget the feel of his body against mine, or how he reeked of cigarettes and beer. This is a story I've been sitting on for a long time, mostly because it makes me realize it's not over yet. The clock is slowly ticking until the time when he is free once again. While I hope he's long since forgotten me, something tells me he hasn't. I should back up a bit though. This happened in 1999 when I was a sophomore in high school. At 14 years old, I had just moved back to America from the Middle East, where I'd spent about 5 or 6 years. because of the standard of dress there and the fact that my old school had uniforms and I had no social life. I didn't own a t-shirt, let alone a pair of jeans. Every single day I went to school wearing a long dress or a long skirt, with my mousy blonde hair tied back with a scarf like a headband. I was awkward, mousy, and had a hard time making friends. This was a couple of years before 9/11, mind you, but in my little town, there was still a lot of animosity towards anyone different. With my British accent and the fact of where I grew up, needless to say, I was pretty different from everyone else. I only had 3 friends: Joe, Nathan, and Kenny. Joe lived on my bus route, though he was way out in the middle of the country, so he and his 2 younger brothers were always the first on the bus in the morning and the last off the bus in the evening. Our days always followed the same schedule. I would get on the bus and go and sit down right next to Joe. We would talk and have fun for a while until we got to school. Then we would hang out with Nathan and Kenny for a bit. We'd all go off and do our separate classes after. I was in advanced placement classes, and they were all in regular ones, so unfortunately I didn't share any classes with them. Every other day our lunches coincided though, so the 4 of us would get together to eat something. Then, in the evenings, Kenny and Nathan would get picked up, and Joe and I would take the bus home together. I don't exactly remember how we started dating in the first place. I think Joe told me he liked me, and I said that I liked him back. Our routine would change ever so slightly after, and we would start holding hands on the bus and at lunchtime. Kenny and Nathan would tease us relentlessly. It was so innocent. Joe was completely sweet and thoughtful, completely non-threatening. He was the type to always make sure you had the better half of something, always first to offer his coat when you were cold, and always pulling out the chairs and opening the doors. A real gentleman. This went on for weeks, though it stayed strictly at school. We weren't able to see each other outside of school because he always had to go straight home or his mother would be furious at some random thing. Sometimes he would come to school with bruises, but he always said it was from roughhousing with his brothers. I didn't really have a reason to doubt him. Then, one day, there was an upcoming half-day for school. Joe suggested he come over to my place and we could have our first afternoon together. We were both very excited. He would take the bus to my stop, then either walk or my parents would drive him home later. It was going to be great. I was beside myself with excitement. Everything went smoothly until the actual half-day arrived. One of his brothers had found out about his plan and told his mother. She then called up the school, apparently shrieking like a banshee and demanding that he come home not a minute late, or he would be in for a world of hurt. He told me at my stop that he would go home and talk to her, then be back as soon as he could, even if he had to walk the whole way. I was a bit worried about him, but he kissed my cheek and said everything would be perfectly fine, and it wouldn't take him more than an hour or so. I went inside and waited and waited. When I finally got tired of waiting inside, I went out with my dog and waited some more. I thought about calling him, but the one time I'd tried that before, his mother had spewed a bunch of venom at me for daring to call their house. The idea made me cringe, so I just waited outside. Eventually, the sun went down altogether, but Joe never showed up. He never called either. I was disappointed, but I decided it was probably for the best. I went about my evening as usual. The next morning, when I got on the bus for school though, the bus driver looked at me and suddenly started sobbing. I thought that was a bit odd, but it was kind of a dreary day in general, so maybe I was reading too much into this. I started heading for the back of the school bus, only to notice that Joe wasn't there. Neither were his 2 brothers. That was odd. I was starting to get worried, but I thought maybe their mother had taken them to school herself that day. The bus route went along as normal for a while, until we came to a heavily forested area where the driver pulled over. She was shaking and crying, not acting like herself at all. Almost immediately, I looked out the window and saw 3 policemen walking up to the bus. Apparently, they had pulled up behind her. She talked to them for a moment, then one of them led her off. The other took the wheel, and the third came and sat by me. I had to sit next to an officer. I thought I must be in trouble for something, especially since there were so many open seats. The man was very nice though. He chatted with me about school and life until we got to campus. Then both of the remaining officers followed us inside. I went to meet up with the boys where I usually did, but Joe was nowhere to be found. Neither of them had seen him yet. We just hoped he was okay. We went about our morning, and first period, I received a page to come to the office immediately. I thought it was about some scholarships I had been working on, but I thought it was weird they would pull me out of class for that. When I got there, the principal, the counselor, and the police were all there. I suddenly felt like a caged rabbit. Then they told me what really happened the night before. When Joe got home, he had told his mother he was coming to see me no matter what, and that was final. Obviously, they argued about it. She grounded him, and then it came to blows. I found out later that his mother had been very abusive to him. It doesn't excuse what happened, but it does add some understanding, at least to me. After the confrontation was over, he laid in bed all night, planning on what he was going to do. He decided he was going to wait for his brothers to go to the school bus and hang back, telling them that he would drive himself to school. Once they were gone, he would take a butcher knife from the kitchen and finish his argument with his mother once and for all. The next morning, everything went as planned for the most part. He got his brothers up and dressed and out for school, and watched until they were at the end of the long driveway to wait for the bus. Then, while his mother was sleeping, he went into her room and stabbed her multiple times. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, the gloomy weather was causing troubles with the bus. I don't know the details, but I know it was running a few minutes late starting its route. One thing I realized while writing this, and that Hollywood seems to miss half the time, is that when you get stabbed while you're sleeping, you tend to wake up. She did so and screamed, and tried to fight back. He was too determined and strong though. Since the bus was running late, the brothers were still standing at the side of the road waiting when they heard the screaming. They both ran back and tried to help. They tried to defend their mother, but Joe turned on them, slicing one of them across the palm and stabbing the other in the gut. He ran when the bus arrived. The driver saw one of the brothers staggering up the driveway, covered in blood. In her panic, she called the police. Eventually, he made it to the corner store a little ways away. Some stories say he crawled there, but I can't really confirm, nor do I really want to. After the police finished questioning me, I was sent home. I remember lying on my parents' bed, staring at the TV, while live coverage of his capture played. I remember even seeing the news chopper filming as the police helicopter followed after Joe. He ran across a field. There was a cop perched out the door and braced on one of the landing struts as the chopper got lower. The cop jumped out and tackled him to the ground. That was the last time I ever saw Joe. The part that creeps me out, though, was what happened afterwards. He pled guilty and was sentenced to 40 years for murder and 20 for the assault on his brother. Not long after, the letters started. I never kept any, but they were all long, crazy ramblings about how we would be together forever, how he killed them for me, and how he truly loved me and would do anything to be with me. No regret, no remorse. He was truly happy about what he did if it meant I was going to be his. We moved a while later, and the letters stopped. I'm happily married now and getting on with my life. Every time I think about him, I remember that he's up for parole in 2020. What happens when he gets out? What happens if he comes looking for me? I'd pulled over for a break on the way to Melbourne from Sydney at a truck stop where there were no street lights or anything. It was pitch black, and there were no other trucks or cars at this stop. I turned off my lights and switched the truck off. I pulled the curtains closed and locked the truck from both sides. I jumped into bed and set my alarm. I set my phone above me in the compartment. I was rolling over from side to side for about 10 to 15 minutes. I couldn't really get to sleep due to it being prime summer temperatures. I was looking up at the ceiling, mentally planning out my day ahead, when suddenly the passenger side door started to open and the cabin light turned on as well. What the hell? Now, this truck was a fairly new model and in pristine condition as well, so there's no question about the door being faulty or anything like that. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, expecting someone to come up and see me sitting there. No one ever tried to enter though, nor was there any noise at all. There was just this eerie quiet silence. Eventually, I grabbed my torch and jumped down. I went out and walked around the truck to see what was going on. There were no other trucks around though, nor were there any cars either. It was just me all alone there. After about 10 to 15 minutes of this really messing with my head, I locked up for sure again and blocked the door, then went to bed. I left before the sun even came up